Hello YouTube. Maybe you've already tried to set up a VM using HyperV on a notebook. It's pretty much simple actually. You just install the HyperV role and you're ready to go. It gets a bit more complicated when you try to set up an environment that includes an Windows Active Directory. Why? Because you on the one hand want to have a private network inside your VM space and you want to access the internet and still have the right name resolution inside your Active Directory space. That's a bit tedious. And if you have Active Directory, you have stuff like time sync. That doesn't correspond well with the time sync that HyperV does try to provide. Also, it doesn't work well with the snapshots inside HyperV that are enabled by default on the notebook. Let me show you. Make sure you have a notebook that is capable of hosting VMs, which means it is Intel VT equipped for Intel CPU and that technology is also enabled in BIOS. You also of course need enough RAM and storage for your VMs, the more the better. And to enable Hyper-V in Windows you need local admin privileges. Please make sure you have those. First of all, we will have to check if your machine has Hyper-V installed and if not, activate it. To check and install Hyper-V, you can use either PowerShell or you can just use the Windows GUI. We will just use the Windows GUI because it's the easiest way for now. Go to Control Panel or Settings, look for Windows Features, and look for Hyper-V. I recommend that you just select the whole thing. This will install the Hyper-V management tools for PowerShell and the GUI. And this will also include the hypervisor itself. Now that we have the Hyper-V role installed, we also can use the Hyper-V management console and the PowerShell commandlets to manage Hyper-V. This will need a reboot, especially if you use BitLocker. Make sure you have a backup of your computer. You can find Hyper-V Manager in the Start menu. It will automatically connect to your new Hyper-V host. This is my notebook. It has an ugly name. I recommend pinning it to your taskbar. You can also use PowerShell to check and operate your VMs, but you need to run the PowerShell as admin for that. So get-VM would list VMs, as we don't have any yet, it's an empty list. When you use Hyper-V to host a multi-system Windows-based environment, we have some challenges. Most of the time you're using Active Directory, which includes its own DNS services. Also, you still want to use internet access to, for example, use Windows updates or to have access to Microsoft's certificate revocation lists, which is sometimes needed to install some software roles. So what we will have to do is prepare the environment to have Active Directory, make sure it has internet access and access to the Active Directory DNS services, and, well, basically make the best possible VM setup. When you open up the Hyper-V management console for the first time, we will have to make some changes. So in the beginning there's no VMs, so there's no content obviously, but you can do some settings to your computer, to your Hyper-V host. On the right hand, you will find settings regarding Hyper-V itself, Virtual Switch Manager. These two we will have to go into. The first ones are in Hyper-V settings. First of all, choose a nice location where to put your virtual disks. You will have to interact with those. The default location for Hyper-V is not perfect. Same goes for virtual machines. Not as important if you don't export and import VMs a lot, but you can change it. Enhanced session mode. That one is also interesting. This allows you to use an RDP-like connection into your VM to copy files, use a clipboard sharing, and even to use like an authentication scheme. So I recommend using that. So Virtual Switch Manager. By default, when you install Hyper-V, it will create a default switch. This switch by default offers network address translation, so you can have shared internet access with your VM host. This is nice. This includes a DHCP server and a DNS server. Be aware, if you're building up Active Directory, you might need to do something about that. Okay. Nevertheless, we will build up an Active Directory and we will build up our own private network for our VMs, which will also enable us to use stuff like our own DHCP services or even Pixie Boot. So let's create our first VM. So let's start and create a new virtual switch. I would recommend using internal. This allows you to communicate with that network from your host machine, not from other network machines. Create internal switch, call it lab or whatever you like it, and you're basically done. So HyperV is tightly integrated into Windows, so you will find that virtual switch as a network adapter also. You go to your adapters and you will find that your computer now has a connection into that lab environment. If it was private instead of internal, you wouldn't see this one. You will also see your Ethernet switch, the default Ethernet switch that offers DHCP and DNS here. If you're having trouble, you can always disable those, but you lose that network address translation if you disable the default switch, and you lose connectivity to that network if you disable the lab one. Just keep in mind. So let's create our first VM that will host our domain controller for that lab. So you choose a name, DC01, why not? You can now modify the location you store to, that's not important for now. I highly recommend using Generation 2 VMs where possible. These use less emulation and more, of HyperV's native performance, basically. Be aware, this only works for 64-bit OS systems and UEFI boot. Generation 2 VMs do not support BIOS boots, they only support UEFI boot. Be aware. So how much memory? For domain controller, I would start with 2 gigs of RAM and allow dynamic memory for that machine. We will look into that later. Dynamic memory helps a lot by saving memory on a Hyper-V host that is, your notebook and is limited in memory, because it allows to query the kernel, the Windows kernel inside a VM, how much memory it actually needs for itself and its applications, and that kernel can give back memory to the host if it doesn't need it. It's kind of similar to VMware ballooning, but less intrusive. It works better, basically. So now you choose your network. Well, on initial setup for the VM itself, I recommend default switch because you get internet access. You can switch that network later when you're starting to use it as a domain controller. I will show you. Create your first hard disk. I can just leave the defaults. It's dynamically expanding, that means it will not be as big as the number here. Now it tells me where to install an operating system from. So my recommendation is get an ISO of Windows Server 16 and, put it in here. So I'll not go into the details of that. You just get your ISO, right? Now we're not done yet. So Hyper-V has some defaults for new VMs that are not perfect. Let's go into the settings of that VM again. Dynamic memory. I don't want the domain controller to have less than 1 gigabyte of memory, and I certainly don't have a terabyte of maximum memory, so I will not allow it to have more than, say, 3 gigabytes of RAM, which is plenty for domain controller. Also, I want to have more than 1 CPU core for that VM. In general, server OS systems need more than 1 CPU core in general. So, going for the integration services. Since we're running a domain controller, it will have its own time services. All the VMs in that domain will sync its time from that domain controller. So, I will disable time synchronization for all VMs from here on. I would also recommend that you think about the other ones like backup and volume shadow copy. It helps if you do production work with those VMs, but it can get interesting results in case you play around. So most important, skip the time sync for now. Okay, checkpoints. Hyper-V on Windows 10 has a bad habit of using automated automated checkpoints. These are bad. These are bad for startup and shutdown performance of your VMs. Just disable that check mark, please. It's really bad. So the other ones I don't care too much about. Now we can just attach that ISO and start installing Windows Server. I will just spool over this. I think you've seen that already.